We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining us. It is the Monday edition of Point of View, and hope you had a wonderful Mother's Day weekend. We certainly did as well, and this week we're going to be focusing on lots of issues. As a matter of fact, of course, we can celebrate the fact that at least the last living American hostage has been released by Hamas. We'll talk more about that. We have a trade deal, well, not exactly, more a pause between the United States and China, but that was good news for the stock market, which went up 1,000 points today, and we'll get into some of that a little bit later this hour. Also, maybe one of the themes, beware of foreign powers bearing gifts. We'll get into that as well. But I thought it would be helpful, as we talk so often here about training your children, and we're talking about that in terms of course, mama bear apologetics and world-proofing your kids in terms of apologetics, but also just the need to teach kids theology, whether it is your youth leader, whether it's you as a parent or a grandparent. I think you're going to benefit from some of the conversation we're going to have today with Hunter Williams. He is a children's pastor at Ridgedale Baptist Church, which is there in Chattanooga, Tennessee. He is also the co-host of Cross-Formed Kid Men podcast. And again, we have some of that information on the website. Graduate of Moody Bible Institute, has his Master of Divinity from Southeastern Baptist Seminary, has contributed a number of articles in places like the Gospel Coalition Kids Matter magazine. And he's the author of this new book, came out earlier this year, How to Teach Kids Theology, Deep Truths for Growing Faith. He's the co-author with Sam Luce. And Hunter, welcome to Point of View.
Thank you for having me. Glad to be here.
Let's talk about confidence. And I was in a meeting this morning. We got talking about youth leaders. And so I started sharing some of the things that we're going to be talking about right now. And you're sort of minding your own business. You're kind of reading through some of the surveys that have been done by a variety of different groups, Barna Research and others. And they're talking about children's ministry. And of course, we can also talk about Lifeway and a variety of others. And all of a sudden, you came across something that caused you to stop, and that is that youth leaders, maybe not you, but others, did not express that they had much confidence in teaching theology, and that maybe, if anything, they felt more comfortable talking about, technology and culture than teaching the doctrines of the church. That is not good news if you want the younger generation to be trained for leadership in the next generation and in the future, is it?
Not at all, no. And that research you're referring to, Awana partnered with the Barna Group a few years ago to produce a research project called Children's Ministry in a New Reality. And there was so many different points of data covered. It's got a wealth of information. But one data point that really stood out to me was they asked that question, how comfortable are you in leading discussions on basic doctrines of the faith? And I was pretty shocked to see that about 40% said they weren't comfortable. And instantly I thought, surely not. I mean, of all the things we should be comfortable doing in the church, it should be teaching doctrines of the church. And when you compare that study with some others that have been going on, you start to see some correlations. The Center for Cultural Research, they did several surveys on worldview. And another point of research that just blew my mind was they were asking different levels of leadership in the church worldview questions, and 12% of children's pastors had a consistently biblical worldview. 12%.
Right.
So you start seeing all these different connecting points of only 12% have a consistent biblical worldview, 40% only are comfortable leading conversations around doctrine. And so you start seeing these connections of, we've got a problem at the top that's also going to affect parents as well, because as the research was showing, parents also are declining in their comfortability on these issues. So that sparked a fire in me, which is why I reached out to my co-author, Sam, and I said, hey, we can wait for a resource to come out that tackles some of these issues, or we can get to work right now and start trying to equip the church in some of these areas.
I might just commend it to those of you that are interested in this area. We do have a link on the website. It's been out for a number of months, but again, you can get it in paperback or Kindle. Let me hold up a book for those of you watching online, and that's our booklet that we have, The Next Generation, a biblical point of view on Next Generation, one that I wrote actually a couple of years ago, probably need to update it, in which you might say, well, do you have some facts and figures there? And of course, we talk about what is happening in terms of the fact that we've certainly seen young people leave the church, and the argument is, well, they're going to come back to church. Well, in some respects, what we're dealing with, Hunter, is not only they're leaving the church physically, they're leaving the church in terms of theologically, because many years ago, that's now almost 2 decades ago, we had an individual on the program by the name of Christian Smith who actually argued that the young teenagers at the time that he was working with subscribed to a worldview called moralistic therapeutic deism. And as a result, this is obviously not Orthodox Christianity. Well, you do the math, and these are the individuals that are already in positions of leadership right now. They may even be parents. And if they don't have good theology, they're passing the bad theology on to their kids. And if we then think that the youth leaders are there to rescue some of that, again, we should be concerned. Hence, one of the reasons why you wrote the book.
Absolutely, and you're absolutely right. When you have a generation raised on moralistic therapeutic deism, which basically is just, I want to feel good about God, God works in my life to make me feel good, those type of things. When you have a generation raised on that, then they're going to pass that on to the next generation. And I think that's why we're seeing some of these caricatures of God that are on the rise in a lot of different avenues. So again, theology is so important, and we're going to talk about that, but theology is at the core of all issues. It really is, whether it's political, scientific, wherever you're landing, theology is at the core of it, because your view of God is going to have a play on how you see everything.
Well, again, one of the things that you quote in here, and we've said it before, we've had R.C. Sproul when he was alive in studio, and that is, he says, everybody's a theologian. So this argument that, well, I'll just have to leave that to the professionals. No, your theology, your worldview is going to be really important, and that's why you really help them understand here how to develop what you might call theological fluency, how to see theology as a story, maybe how to simplify some of that and start at a very young age. So what I thought we'd do is take a break, and we'll come back and we'll talk about maybe how you can put it all together, because it's never too late to begin, but it also is never too early to start. And I love one of the diagrams you have from birth to the 5th grade. I think a lot of people think, well, that's pretty heavy stuff for grade school kids. And I think you want to come back and help us understand that really when these questions come up, this can be a teaching moment, and in some respects, it's like the Old Testament Shema. So we're going to come back and talk about a little bit more this book, How to Teach Kids Theology, Deep Truths for Growing Faith. If you're a youth leader, you really need the book, but I would have to say that any parent or grandparent would really benefit from the book, because it really gives you some very clear ideas about how to pass on godly theology from this generation to the next. So we'll continue our conversation with Hunter Williams right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Mike Rowe, host of Dirty Jobs, warns that if President Trump's tariffs bring manufacturing jobs back to America, those positions will be hard to fill. He was on the Theo Vaughn program to talk about the manufacturing industry. He explains that if President Trump can reinvigorate the manufacturing sector, the increase in the new jobs will pose a problem, since we presently have about 482,000 open positions in manufacturing already. Adding another 2 to 3 million new jobs will pose a problem. He talked about what I've discussed in previous commentaries, a twofold problem, a skills gap and a will gap. He pointed to a survey of 1,000 U.S.-based 18 to 20-year-olds that discovered that 3/4 of them perceive a stigma with choosing vocation school over attending a 4-year college. Put simply, young adults show little interest in joining the blue-collar workforce because they have not been exposed to the industry in school. School administrators took shop classes out of high school. They robbed them of the opportunity to even see what kind of work even looks like. Instead, Mike Rowe laments that we told a whole generation of kids they must get a 4-year college degree. Mike Rowe also mentioned a statistic that I've documented in previous commentaries. It is a disturbing number, 6.8 million able-bodied men that are not working and not looking for work. This number of young men not working and not looking for work is unprecedented. It is time for educational leaders and industry leaders to change attitudes towards working in manufacturing. It is also time to challenge pastors, parents, and other leaders to encourage this generation to develop a work ethic. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Inflation, go to viewpoints.info/inflation. That's viewpoints.info/inflation. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today with Hunter Williams, the co-author of the book, How to Teach Kids Theology, Deep Truths for Growing Faith. And Hunter, obviously, the first step is for you as a parent, a grandparent, a Sunday school teacher, frankly, even a pastor, to make sure that you understand the great doctrines of the Christian faith. But one I mentioned before we went to the break, you've got a diagram there about what you can do before you even get to the 5th grade. And the first question that comes to the mind, I think of many, is how can I distill that down? And you make a distinction early on in the book about the difference between simplification and distillation. And maybe we could take the doctrine of sin and illustrate that, because a lot of people think, well, some of these doctrines are pretty heavy. I mean, after all, we usually encourage somebody who has gone to a Bible school like Moody Bible Institute, or somebody who's gone to seminary like you have at Southeastern Baptist Seminary. And that's not exactly the same kind of brain that is maybe a 3rd grader. So how would you maybe address this doctrine of sin in a way that does enough communication of it, but doesn't oversimplify it and thus lead to maybe some kind of heresy?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that is the big question we got as we were jumping into this book is, Hunter, they would say, we see the need for teaching kids theology, but how do you do it in a way that's both biblically faithful, but also age appropriate? And so we tried to give this helpful distinction between simplification and distillation. Simplification, what we mean by that is where you're watering something down to the point that it's to the point where it's almost meaningless. Whereas distillation is where you're extracting and elevating essential elements. So let me give you an example with the doctrine of sin. So one way we can dilute the doctrine of sin is by saying sin is doing something wrong. And the problem with that definition is it is so diluted that it doesn't mean anything. Because think about it, doing something wrong. Well, wrong according to whom? Because what the world says is wrong is going to be different than what the Bible says is wrong. But also, if you say sin is just anything that we do that's bad or anything that's bad. Well, a child's going to fill in the blanks of what that means. They might think broccoli's bad, is broccoli sin? And so it's so diluted and so vague, it's meaningless.
Well said.
Where when you distill the doctrine of sin, what you're trying to do is you're trying to make a concise, memorable definition or way of talking about it. And one tip or tool I could give your listeners right away is if you want a great example of distilling doctrine or theological truths, look at some of the catechisms that have come throughout the centuries. That's basically what a catechism is. It's taking these big ideas in the Bible and breaking them down into simple questions and answers. So, for example, if I was looking at the doctrine of sin, there's a lot of great catechisms that give short, memorable answers to what sin is. One catechism, the Cross-Formed Kids Catechism, it defines sin as doing what God forbids or not doing what God commands. What I love about this definition is it defines sin in relation to God,
yes,
which is what must be stated about sin. If your definition of sin doesn't mention anything about God in it, then you really are off on the mark. Because a good way to think about theology and the definition we give is the application of God's revelation to all of life, or God's revelation to all things. So when you think about sin, if you're not understanding sin in light of who God is, then you're going to miss the mark on it. So that's why I think this is a great example of good distillation of a doctrine. Sin is doing what God forbids or not doing what God commands. You could even distill it further and say sin is wanting to do things our way instead of God's way. And so these are some examples of trying to find that balance of, yes, we want to be biblically faithful, but we also want to be age appropriate. And that comes by making memorable hooks that our kids can hang their understanding on.
Well said. And again, you talk about the fact that we kind of teach a Cliff's Notes version of the Bible, where we avoid some difficult stories and passages, and we try to oversimplify everything. And I thought I might just mention that along the way, you also give some great recommendations. For example, teaching kids from age 3 to 5, well, the book by Ken Taylor, Everything a Child Should Know About God, all the way up to kids that are 5 to 9, 9 to 13, all the way up to 13 to 18. Of course, we've interviewed Wayne Grudem, Christian Beliefs, 20 Questions Every Christian Should Know. So you give some very concrete kinds of ideas about how to teach that and make some very clear statements. But one of the keys that come later in your book is this idea of developing a plan. It does seem to me that if you don't have a plan, you're going to ultimately miss some opportunities, because there are those teachable moments. It can come when they see something on their phone, or they see something on television, they hear something at church, or maybe they are singing a song that's maybe one they sang, then you can illustrate a doctrinal issue, or if it's a secular song, maybe point out a doctrinal mistake. And so in some respects, you do need to sort of have a plan. And so near the end of the book, you have putting it all together so that you can take all the bits and pieces that seem like it's a little bit overwhelming, and you sort of plot it out, and then you're going to have something that, like I said, is like a catechism or even like a Bible curriculum, which as your children or grandchildren get older, they get to learn more and they get into the deeper aspects of some of the theology.
Yes. I love that you said we need a plan. There's that old phrase, if you don't have a plan, then you're planning to fail. We have to go into both ministry and parenting with intentionality. Too many people, too many churches, it can be so easy to think just because they're kids, we can just, oh, it's fine. They'll figure it out. We don't have to get too serious right now. We'll wait till they're older. But the problem with waiting till kids are older is we're missing a crucial mark of their development. So many research projects have shown that a child's moral compass and worldview is predominantly shaped by the age of 13.
Yes.
Which means if it's set around the age of 13, that means the primary time it's shaped is in their elementary years. Because once you go beyond 13, what happens is instead of building a worldview, you have to deconstruct, then rebuild, which is so much extra work.
Yes.
When I say on the front end, if you can be strategic and intentional with how you're spending time with your kids and the ways you're developing their view of God, then as they get into the 13 beyond, you've given them a solid foundation. That's why I don't understand why we would wait so long when we can give them such a great foundation early on.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why in chapter 7, we did want to bring it all together, because we introduced so many practical tips, concepts, resources, and we wanted to show here's an example of how you could put it together. And so one thing we suggest to do in that chapter is to start with the end in mind. So let's say you think about a 5th grader or a 6th grader. It is very helpful, whether you're a pastor listening or a parent, to sit down with a piece of paper in front of you or on a tablet and think through, what are the things I want my child to know, do, and experience by the time they're in 6th grade? And write those out in detail. You know, maybe you want them to know the gospel. You want them to know the 10 commandments. Maybe you want them to know the Apostles' Creed, the Lord's Prayer. Whatever you want them to know, write it down. Then in the do section, you write down, what are things I would like them to be able to do by the time they're in 6th grade? And maybe it's be able to share their faith or defend their faith or serve in some capacity in the church or at home. You write those things down specifically, and then experience. What are things I'd like for my child to experience?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you want them to experience receiving a very special Bible at their church, or maybe you want them to experience going to a camp that your church offers. Whatever it is, you write. The big thing I want people to take away is, if you don't get specific, you will miss the target.
Yes.
The easiest way to hit a target is to make it as specific as possible. So to write down these things you want your child to know, do, and experience by the time they're in 6th grade, and then you work backwards and you make mile markers that lead to that goal. And so, you know, you might think, okay, if I want my child to be able to share the gospel, then when they're in preschool, I'm going to start introducing them to key concepts of the gospel, like who God is, what is sin, what did Christ do? And then as they get to early elementary, you start giving them some tools on how they could share it for themselves.
Yeah.
So, for example, in our children...
And just plan it all out.
Go ahead.
Yeah. I'm
right.
almost out of time, so I wanted to just mention real quickly that the book is available, 8 chapters. We have a link to crossformkids.com. And at the end of each one of the chapters, you have some great questions. So if you would want to use this for a small group discussion or something else, this is a book we would recommend. So, Hunter Williams, thank you for being with us. And let me again encourage you to find out more by going to the website, pointofview.net.
At Point of View, we believe there is power in prayer, and that is why we have relaunched our Pray for America campaign, a series of weekly emails to unite Americans in prayer for our nation. Imagine if hundreds of thousands of Americans started praying intentionally together on a weekly basis. You can help make that a reality by subscribing to our Pray for America emails. Just go to pointofview.net and click on the Pray for America banner that's right there on the homepage. Each week you'll receive a brief news update, a specific prayer guide, and a free resource to equip you in further action. We encourage you to not only pray with us each week, but to share these prayers and the resources with others in your life. Join the movement today. Visit pointofview.net and click on the banner Pray for America right there at the top. That's pointofview.net. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in our land. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, let's see if we can get into some of the issues in the news, but I know you probably benefited from this idea of how to teach kids theology, and if you want to pass that information on to someone who would benefit, it could be a youth leader, it could be a parent, a grandparent, a friend, neighbor. You certainly can take some of the material we've posted on the website, or even think about getting a copy of the book. Let me also mention that a few of the booklets that I've done certainly get into that. One on the biblical point of view on the next generation. We produced that about 2 years ago, summarizing some of these surveys that have come out that, again, illustrate that we have work to do if we're going to make sure that the next generation has a biblical worldview and has good, solid, orthodox theology. So that booklet is one that came out a while ago, and the one that now probably has arrived in all of your mailboxes, and it's the one called False Spirituality, where I actually quoted from this idea of moralistic therapeutic deism, but also with the idea from an evangelistic point of view. What do you do when you run into people that say, well, I'm spiritual but not religious, and what you can do to maybe address that issue? So just a lot of practical things we like to give to you at Point of View. And one last one, of course, you've been hearing us last week talk about the fact that we are encouraging you, if you would want to do so, to sign up to get my Viewpoints commentary. The one today is on bringing manufacturing back to the U.S. We'll get to that a little bit later today. And you can subscribe. There's a banner there that Karen has created, and you can click on that. You receive an email that is the text of what I do on about 600 radio stations. That text comes to your inbox Monday through Friday. Penedexters comes to you on Saturday, since she writes a weekly commentary. It's free of charge, and I don't see why you wouldn't want to get it. Even if you get a lot of emails, sometimes one email that has some facts and figures or some insight that you can use or pass on to others, I think is certainly worth the opportunity. But let's get into this. If you are on the website, pointofview.net, you'll notice that my first article was a claim that we were going to have an announcement today. And of course, now we have the announcement that the argument originally was this whole confrontation between Donald Trump and Xi Jinping, between the United States and China, is going to be a disaster. And Matt Vesta said the left was really hoping that the various talks would collapse. The media even seemed to be hoping that President Trump and his team, that would be in particular Secretary of Treasury Scott Bessent and Trade Representative Jamieson Greer, would fail. Just think of what that requires, that I really hope the country will fail. Really? Is that the position you're taking right now? But nevertheless, let me go on. And so the announcement came out as the two parties left Switzerland, and it said the U.S. and China have agreed on a deal to help resolve the trade war raging between the world's two largest economies. Top Trump officials announced on Sunday. Details of the deal, which now we have, struck during negotiations with Switzerland over the weekend, were not revealed, but will be shared on Monday. And I thought it was kind of interesting because the U.S. Trade Ambassador, Jamieson Greer, I think you're going to hear more from him as well, said, quote, "This was, as the secretary pointed out, a very constructive 2 days. It's important to understand how quickly we were able to come to an agreement, which reflects that perhaps the differences were not so large as may be thought." And that brings me back to a point we've made before. The differences in some ways ideologically between China and the United States are vast, and you can certainly see that we have documented that very well in our Outlook magazine a while back on China. But though the differences politically are different, and maybe even economically sometimes, the need for one country that needs the other, especially China needs the market of the United States, can bring a lot of people who wouldn't talk to each other and wouldn't work out a deal together because, in some respects, I suspected that this would be the kind of announcement that we would have. So what do we now know? This just came out a few hours ago. The U.S. and China have agreed to lower their respective reciprocal tariffs for 90 days as they look to end a bruising trade war between the world's two largest economies. This comes from Brittany Bernstein that was looking at this. And the Treasury Secretary, that's Scott Bessent, told reporters that the U.S. and China have agreed to temporarily reduce tariffs by more than 100 percentage points. So what does that mean? The United States will reduce tariffs on Chinese imports from 145% to 30%. So that's more than 100% there. And in China's case, they'll reduce the tariffs on American goods from 125% to 10%. So I think this was very significant. And again, there are so many people that are seeing this opportunity as a window. Now, again, let's recognize, as we just pointed out, Jamison Greer said, we saw that there were differences, but at the same time, we also were amazed at how quickly this came together. Likewise, the trade representative for China, Lin Chenggang, said, as regards to the timing for the release of the joint statement, as we say back in China, if the dishes are delicious, then timing is not a matter. So I think no matter when this statement is released, it's going to be big news, good news for the world. I do love that line. If the dishes are delicious, then timing is not an issue. So I'm sure that sounds better in the Mandarin. But nevertheless, China and the United States are at the moment in some agreement. Don't want to overplay this, but the stock market took note. And last time I checked, and I haven't been checking while we've been on the air here, but the other time I checked, stock market went up a lot of points, almost 1,000 points. So that's what I think some of the nervous Nellies in Wall Street were worried about. We'll get into this whole idea of manufacturing jobs and what that might mean if we could actually bring some of these manufacturing jobs that are right now in China back to the United States, what that means in just a minute. But let me take the other very important issue, and that is that Hamas has now announced that they have indeed released the last living American hostage in Gaza. That's Eden Alexander, which I think marks, if you will, a major milestone in the long-running negotiations between the U.S. and the Hamas and the United States. Now, interestingly enough, Eden Alexander holds dual Israeli-American citizenship. He was handed over to representatives from the International Committee of the Red Cross, according to the Israeli military. And interestingly enough, Hamas, the terrorist group, said Sunday that it would release the 21-year-old unconditionally after talks with the Trump administration. Now, again, you can think that maybe Trump and the administration's taking more credit than they deserve. But here's where we are. I mean, we had opportunities to have this young man released a long time ago, and there have been some veiled threats. And then, of course, with Donald Trump, nothing's ever veiled. Not so veiled threats against Hamas, and that is the case. In case you wonder, Alexander's parents traveled from New Jersey to Israel for their son's release. And Donald Trump wrote this on Truth Social, and I'll kind of end it there. This was a step taken in good faith towards the United States and the efforts of the mediators, Qatar, as many people say, and Egypt, to put an end to this very brutal war and return all living hostages and remains to their loved ones. Hopefully, this is the first of those final steps necessary to end this brutal conflict. We'll see where that is. If you think about it right now, the bargaining chip that Hamas has been the hostages. When they give up the hostages, there's really no more bargaining chips. And so it's quite possible that they will drag their feet, which I sort of expect. And then I also expect the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, will then go into Hamas. Next step is, I suspect we're going to see some of the protests we talked about on Friday on campus once again, although many students will have left, or protests in other venues around the country. So stay tuned. We expect a lot more to come there as well. After we come back from the break, let me at least address another issue that's kind of surfaced under the rubric, this borrowing again from Jim Garrity, who does such a good job, beware of foreign powers bearing gifts. You know, you've heard beware of Greeks bearing gifts. Well, what about other countries, China, or in this case, Qatar? Some say Qatar, and we'll get into that issue, but also talk about the manufacturing jobs. And then we'll come back in the next hour, going to talk about fine arts education for a few minutes. We love to talk about the arts, and I thought this article in Modern Age would be one that you would appreciate. And then we're going to get back into some of the controversy. We've had some Democrats storming a detention center for ICE. What does that mean? And a few other issues that we will address today. So lots to cover. Let's take a break. We'll be back with more right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, one of the controversies that you'll be hearing about, and I always like to give you a little bit of information so you can kind of front run it, is the fact that we now have President Donald Trump going over to the Middle East. He's going to go to Qatar, sometimes called Qatar, and they have decided to actually give to the United States a new Air Force One. It's a 747-8 jumbo jet, and there are some that have said we shouldn't be accepting gifts from foreign governments. And my argument is probably that's true, but the people that might have the greatest standing to say that would be those who have pointed out all of the other gifts that have been given to universities, to governments, even to the previous president and his son. If you were then criticizing those, then I think you might are at least on stable ground to criticize this. But it is amazing the people now upset about this 747 jet that could be and probably will be the next Air Force One, that this, interestingly enough, is something that they have their, to use an old phrase, knickers in their knot, or hair on fire, whatever phrase you want to use, and turned a complete blind eye to some of the other things taking place. For example, last Wednesday, if you received the commentaries, the Viewpoint commentaries we've suggested that you might subscribe to on Wednesday, I did Elite Universities Part 2. The first one dealt with some of the cost of the universities and the lack of intellectual diversity. But then the next problem I pointed out was foreign influence on campus. And Victor Davis Hanson looked up the numbers, and I think actually they're even worse than his, because he was really just looking over the few decades where we have records. But okay, using that over the past few decades, foreign governments, without any audit from the federal government, have poured $60 billion into America's prestigious universities. And again, he's just talking about the prestigious ones, the so-called Ivy Leagues or others. And so that's why Jim Garrity today says, well, beware of foreign powers bearing gifts. If you're going to get upset about this, you might, for example, go back to the University of Pennsylvania. Remember where that is? That is an Ivy League school. And you remember we actually had an institution there that was part of what was called the Penn Biden Center. You remember who Biden is? Yeah, the president. And there were concerns about the fact that there were foreign gifts, there were contracts, there were millions, hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars that were pouring into the Penn Biden Center. By the way, the reason it's called the Penn Biden Center now is when Joe Biden and Hunter Biden aren't in positions of influence anymore, they finally decided that, well, maybe what we should do is just merge this into one of the other University of Pennsylvania entities, because now no way to actually funnel money in that regard. One particular group would be the American First Legal Foundation, filed a complaint with the IRS, contending that the Penn Biden Center, and this is their quote, function as a vehicle for Penn to raise and funnel large amounts of Chinese communist money to Joe Biden and his political cronies, unquote. Now, again, that hasn't been adjudicated, but that's the claim. And, of course, if you then say, well, what's happened since Joe Biden's in office? Well, the Penn Biden Center hasn't posted anything on Facebook since 2021, or even posted anything on X since 2022, which is kind of interesting. Even when he was in office, not that helpful. It was more helpful when he was out of office, as you might have known. And, of course, we've talked about that as well. So with that as background, then when you have so many people upset about the fact that the United States government, not Donald Trump, will receive this Boeing 747 jumbo jet that is being given, as I understand it, to the Defense Department, and will provide an opportunity for an upgraded plane. Donald Trump, of course, always engaging in a little bit of hyperbole, says that the plane is so opulent that he calls it the Flying Palace. And I think the other concern is, what does it look like, the optics about this? As if, Donald Trump's going to be more favorable to Qatar because he gets a plane than he wouldn't. But okay, that the optics is one. The bigger issue is we're just hearing about it now. I'm looking at my calendar and it says it's May 12th. And even as recently as May 1st, which is almost 2 weeks ago, Wall Street Journal was talking about the fact that the deal was almost halfway done then, because they had reported the U.S. government has commissioned an overhaul of a Boeing 747, formerly known and used by the Qatari government. And a Melbourne, Florida-based company is tasked with retrofitting the plane with certain specialized systems to transform the luxury aircraft into a presidential jet. And so, again, I recognize that there is going to be a lot of complaints about, well, what about this gift that was given to the Trump administration and is now perhaps going to be the future Air Force One? I think there's some legitimate concerns about that. But the people that are raising these concerns never seem to be very concerned about literally the billions of dollars that have gone to universities, the hundreds of millions of dollars that even went to the Penn Biden Center. And I think you would be a lot more legitimate, and your criticisms might be taken a little more seriously if by chance you had seen some concerns about actual money going to an actual center, and money obviously in many cases funneled to the Biden family. And of course, we've talked about that many times before here on Point of View. Well, when we come back, we're going to get into this whole issue of fine arts education, because that is another aspect where I think we should, as Christians, be focused. But let me just mention that my commentary today is about manufacturing jobs. And if you get the commentary, you'll see that the picture that Karen has put with that is a picture of Mike Rowe. Of course, he's best known as the host of Dirty Jobs, but he has raised the same question, of course, we have here as well, that if indeed we're going to actually bring more jobs back to the United States, and I think that's possible, we could maybe add another 2 million, possibly 3 million new jobs. A lot of that would be in manufacturing, but here's the catch. At the moment, we have 482,000 open positions in manufacturing. So it does seem to me that there is a real need to kind of change the stigma. And in here I talk about a survey which was done of young 18 to 20-year-olds and found that most of them felt there was kind of a stigma with going to vocational school rather than attending a four-year college. And I point out the fact that we took shop classes out of high school. Good news is that's starting to reverse, and I see some very positive elements in that as well, because if you're not exposed to the kinds of things that you could do in manufacturing, then indeed you can understand that you probably wouldn't see that as worthwhile. As a disclaimer, my first job was in a machine shop, so I know only so well what it's like to cut metal. I know what it's like to clean it up. I know what it's like to do recycling. I know what it's like to ship things in and out. I know what it's like to read a blueprint, on and on and on. And I just think that young people would benefit from seeing that some of those jobs would be really productive for them as well. And if we're going to bring manufacturing jobs back to the United States, I think that's a good idea. We need to have the youngest generation see that as a very important job that they could perhaps fulfill and do very well at. Anyway, that's my commentary for today. You can find it on the website, pointofview.net. We'll be back right after this.
Have you subscribed to the Viewpoints commentary? No? Well, you're missing out on an essential free resource straight from Point of View's Kerby Anderson. Viewpoints are Kerby's free daily email commentaries covering any and every issue relevant to your faith, your family, and your freedom. And what makes Viewpoints essential is how packed they are with information you will not get anywhere else, while also being a quick read. In 2 minutes or less, you can become better educated about an important issue affecting America. And Viewpoints is easily shareable, making it a great resource to forward to your friends or also to post on social media. Don't miss out on this essential free resource from Kerby Anderson and Point of View. Join the thousands of Americans who receive Viewpoints by enrolling today. Do it right now at pointofview.net. pointofview.net/enroll. Again, it's free and it takes just a moment. pointofview.net/enroll. Point of View will continue after this.
I do appreciate Point of View and what you folks are doing. You really are doing a great job to educate and to help Christian folks do a better job to honor Christ in all that we do.
My husband and I are your supporters. We just really appreciate the show and the people you bring on.
I just want to commend you guys on your program. I love listening to you. It's a blessing. Been listening to you for several years. Your program has helped my family see current events and elections and politics through the eyes and the principles of Scripture. And that's been enlightening, and we're trying to pass that on to others.
I want to say, first of all, that I really enjoyed the Millennial Roundtable, and I love the program altogether. I think Kerby is great, and I really appreciate all of y'all, all that y'all do, and the truth that y'all put out.
Hey, great show. Love all your comments and what you're talking about.
Thanks again for what you do.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, we're going to spend some time, first of all, talking about the arts, and in particular, fine arts education. I might just point you to another booklet that we have, this one done by Steve Miller, who is, of course, our producer. This one I'm holding up for those of you watching online, called A Biblical Point of View on Imagination. This is kind of the Cliff's Notes version. You can actually go online and read the entire essay there as well, and really going all the way back to the 1970s when I was a young Christian. One of the things that I benefited from the most was a book by Francis Schaeffer called Art and the Bible. And it does seem to me that Christians should not give up on the arts. They should be at the forefront of some of that. And so I thought it would be very appropriate to actually point you to a very good article that came out in Modern Age called Art Without Instruction. And we're going to get into that in a few minutes. And then also then the last part of this hour, get into a couple of other controversies. There's, of course, been a back and forth about what took place at this ICE detention center, and we'll talk about that since it involves some members of Congress, and there are accusations back and forth on that. Also, a couple of things happened in the State Department. Of course, this last hour, we also got talking about the trade deal with China and many others. So each day, I want to try to focus on some issues in the news, but also look at some of the broader issues, and this is one that I think you would find to be very helpful. Joey McFadden is the author of this article. He's a journalist and also an artist in Brooklyn, New York. He's a writer and commentator with Young Voices. We've had many people on the program with Young Voices. I might just mention his paintings can be seen on Instagram, but we also have a link to his Substack. He did an interview, a podcast a while back on art and ideology, and you can find many of the other resources there on the website at pointofview.net. But Joey, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Let's, if we can, help people understand how, in some respects, art has changed. And that is, we can go back to, say, the Middle Ages, and individuals there were part of a guild. And so if you wanted to be a painter like you, if you wanted to be an artist of some sort, you would study in a guild as an apprentice, wouldn't you?
Yes. So, back in the Middle Ages, if you wanted to make art, you would study under a master and you would learn from that master. And that's what really becoming an artist meant in the Middle Ages.
And it does seem to me that that's what we're talking about here, that there was an emphasis for some time on really developing your craft. And as you point out early on in the paper, there's been this idea that, well, now that we've been able to get rid of wokeness, by the way, I should have held up my booklet on wokeness as well, but nevertheless, that maybe we can restore excellence to the fine arts. But your argument in this essay is, well, that's helpful, but there are some other issues because we sort of move from this idea of learning your craft to almost, I don't know, maybe I'm overemphasizing a little bit, to making it more academic. Instead of learning how to be an artist, you sort of learn how to be an art critic. But help us out, because that's really the kind of the fundamental issue in your essay, isn't it?
That's sort of, I think you're kind of getting at it. The point that I'm making is that for centuries or even millennia, there's been really rigorous technical education
whether it be through a guild or through the formal academies. And in the art schools for decades, you did have fairly rigorous training. But beginning sometime in the later 20th century, you had this degradation where, you didn't really need technique anymore, and everything became about sort of the ideas behind the art. I mean, you could learn those things, and there might be some classes on them, but standards had really fallen away, and there was no kind of objective measurement of quality anymore. So what changed is the idea that being an artist is attached to some kind of mastery of a particular set of skills that allow you to articulate a vision. And that has kind of fallen apart. It doesn't mean that these skills aren't taught anywhere. It doesn't mean that there aren't art schools that teach well. But, the art schools, particularly within the fine arts, not necessarily architecture or graphic design or industrial design, but in the fine arts in particular, by and large, are pretty lacking in rigorous education.
Yeah. And if you actually just go down from the studio just a couple of miles, you get to the Dallas Art Institute. I've got a friend that has been teaching there. Actually, he's one that's going with us when we go to Greece next week. And there you do get into it. But early on, you talk about the fact that there was what was called, and I learned about this in your piece, College Art Association. And the first president was trying to struggle with, okay, if this is supposed to be fitting in with all the other liberal arts in a college, then we probably need to spend some time teaching theory and talking about some things other than just practical training in the arts. Is that right?
That's absolutely right. And that still affects the art schools to a significant degree. I mean, my personal experience, and the experience of many of my peers who went to art school, is that in the classroom itself is not necessarily a theory-heavy environment. There might be some, sometimes it depends on the students, but there might be a separate class where you learn theory, and it's very dominant. It's all about deconstructing the art. But yeah, the theory stuff, I think, has really taken us away from appreciating the art as object, or looking at the art as something that we appreciate visually. It all becomes very much about the idea of the art and academizing, the theory. I mean, that was the struggle really in bringing the fine arts into the liberal scholastic environment, was reconciling the interests of art historians, of the aesthetic philosophers, of the painters, of the sculptors. And, these fields used to be almost kind of fused into one, and eventually they had to kind of figure out how to reconcile them in the scholastic environment. And that ended up, not immediately, but over time, kind of degrading technical education. This is something that Howard Singerman talks about in his book, Art Subjects.
Yes.
He's probably the preeminent historian of art schools.
And again, as you say at one point, by the late 20th century, as art became distinct from technique, art schools conceived of themselves as existing to resolve the problem of the artist. And so students attended gallery openings, read high theory, forged their own paths, often outside of the confines of tradition, to become artists. And that maybe for some illustrates only so well why some people say, this just doesn't look like the art that we used to know. And since we're coming to a break, I'll come back and get some more perspective from you. But I do remember a time when one of my roommates, actually he was going to be an architect, but he had taken classes in art. And that was where, of course, you would be taking all sorts of things like drawing, and you would take the human form and all of the rest. And in the past, of course, if you were not able to draw a hand or the body correctly, there would be people, in particular professors or even TAs, to come around and try to correct what you're doing. Now, as you point out, it's a little bit different. So we come back and talk about how that has changed dramatically, so that even individuals that are in the arts say, the fine arts have become kind of a wasteland and a lack of technical education. And so that may be something that you'll find interesting in this article. It's entitled Art Without Instruction. We'll continue our conversation with Joey McFadden right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Mike Rowe, host of Dirty Jobs, warns that if President Trump's tariffs bring manufacturing jobs back to America, those positions will be hard to fill. He was on the Theo Vaughn program to talk about the manufacturing industry. He explains that if President Trump can reinvigorate the manufacturing sector, the increase in the new jobs will pose a problem since we presently have about 482,000 open positions in manufacturing already. Adding another 2 to 3 million new jobs will pose a problem. He talked about what I've discussed in previous commentaries, a twofold problem, a skills gap and a will gap. He pointed to a survey of 1,000 U.S.-based 18 to 20-year-olds that discovered that 3/4 of them perceive a stigma with choosing vocation school over attending a four-year college. Put simply, young adults show little interest in joining the blue-collar workforce because they have not been exposed to the industry in school. School administrators took shop classes out of high school. They robbed them of the opportunity to even see what kind of work even looks like. Instead, Mike Rowe laments that we told a whole generation of kids they must get a four-year college degree. Mike Rowe also mentioned a statistic that I've documented in previous commentaries. It is a disturbing number, 6.8 million able-bodied men that are not working and not looking for work. This number of young men not working and not looking for work is unprecedented. It is time for educational leaders and industry leaders to change attitudes towards working in manufacturing. It is also time to challenge pastors, parents, and other leaders to encourage this generation to develop a work ethic. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Inflation, go to viewpoints.info/inflation. That's viewpoints.info/inflation. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, talking about Art Without Instruction, and it is written by Joey McFadden. Let me just mention, if you go to the Substack, which we've provided there, you might want to type in Joey T. McFadden. That'll help you find all sorts of different articles, podcasts, and other resources that are there. But Joey, let me get into this because it seems to me, and I learned this by reading your article, maybe this whole idea of art classes have changed. You say fine arts professors have a degree of academic freedom that borders on anarchy. I smiled at that one. Liberty to teach whatever they want, however they want, or not to teach at all. And you pointed out that many art professors simply sit, walk around, or converse with their students, providing little instruction or guidance. And the bottom line is that you have individuals that have maybe taken even advanced classes that say they feel sort of cheated because they really didn't learn anything. And so the model that we just talked about a few minutes ago in terms of a guild and an apprentice and learning from a master, that seems to have evaporated in some of these art classes.
Yes, I would definitely agree with that. I mean, I think something important to note is that in most art schools, you have a year called Foundations, where you actually do have rigorous instruction. I remember when I was in Foundations, and my peers who've been in Foundations can attest to that. That does exist. But following that, in subsequent years of instruction, you tend to have a sort of a fear to the students' work, or there's no unified set of standards, or there's no kind of overarching curriculum that explains this is what we're supposed to learn in this sequential order. And that's all just kind of evaporated. And, so some students who are very self-guided end up doing fine, and they use art school to network and stuff. And I know people who do that. Other people who came there to find real guidance, technically speaking, are often very disappointed because it basically just doesn't exist.
Yes. Well, let's talk about the other aspect of critique. By the way, I might just mention that even though we're introducing you as a painter, also you're a journalist, and you've got information and some great commentary on identity politics and some of the political issues. Of course, I mentioned the one on art and ideology, even a column recently on the VP debate and all sorts of things. So I want people to go and kind of dig deeply there. But part of that gets down to critique, and that is you produce whatever it might be. It might be a sculpture, it might be a painting, could be even if you're in a photography class, whatever. And then the goal is to provide some criteria to evaluate that person's work. And the problem you point out, and I think it gets back to wokeness and some other issues, is, I think illustrated by that book, The Room of Silence, you really can't talk about certain things because if that artistic piece relates to race, to gender, a variety of other things, all you can simply do is kind of affirm the person and not even question whether or not that was even a good piece of art. Is that fair?
I think that that's fair. Room of Silence is actually a student documentary. It's in a book, but it was made in 2016, so a little while ago.
Yeah.
But, it kind of at sort of the height of political correctness and I think this is probably still a problem in our schools because they're so progressive. But, a critique is supposed to be evaluating the work, and it's difficult to evaluate the work when the students are sensitive or when the work focuses on a subject that people don't want to talk about because they're afraid to. I think that's been starting to change culturally, but universities are probably holdouts where it's so difficult to do that. And it's interesting that I actually know someone who happens to be African-American who left an art school because he felt like no one would critique his work when it focused on racial subjects, and he found it very frustrating.
Yeah.
And it's in the documentary, one of the students literally says, but how can I know if I'm not making good work if you're not going to give me feedback? If it's about an issue like race, that's important. So I think that still is a problem. The students are sensitive. They might report you to an administrator. I've known people to whom this has happened where they're investigated for these privileged reasons, and they're afraid to critique the student's work, and so it kind of shuts down. Lori Fendrick has talked about this a lot. She's a painting emerita from Hofstra, and she's written about this subject. I quote her in the piece.
Their aspect of that is self-censorship. That was part of that documentary, self-censorship in the art schools. And, of course, we've seen, Joey, self-censorship in a variety of other areas as well. Students won't take on a paper that might get some kind of negative reaction from fellow students or from the professor. And in some respects, in the place where you would expect art to have maybe the greatest freedom and the greatest use of, again, to use the word that we use in our booklet that Stephen Myers put together on imagination, it really stifles imagination if indeed there are sort of no-go areas in terms of artistic expression or no-go areas in terms of critiquing, and so that's not helpful for the flourishing of arts in the 21st century, do you think?
You're right. I mean, just like how self-censorship hinders the sciences or history because you can't just confirm bad ideas, you can't really help guide someone toward improving the quality of their art if you can't talk about, quality or standards. And, the idea that it's all just subjective. I mean, when you look at something and it just looks ugly and uninteresting and incomplete, it's a good thing to be able to say that. It's a good thing to be able to have some set of standards of quality and to be able to communicate that to people. If you can't communicate that to people, then they're not going to be able to learn.
Let's, just before I let you go, talk about something else, and that is you kind of end your essay by talking about the fact that the United States may be entering a period of national change more significant than the destruction of woke ideology, and that is some of these universities that have been, as you say, culturally stale, maybe have a chance to redefine themselves. And it does seem to me that you are one of the many people we've quoted from younger voices. Matter of fact, tomorrow we'll have a millennial roundtable where we'll have a roundtable of individuals addressing that. But it does seem that you are seeing the possibility of some cultural shifts. So share from your perspective what you see right now and what you think might happen in the future.
Well, I think that some universities are starting to realize that, they really do need to be places of open discussion. I was just at a group discussion at Columbia University where we talked about whether or not universities should cooperate with ICE. So, there's, I think we're at a period now where people are really feeling like more open to wanting to have conversations with each other, to talking about difficult subjects. And I think universities might be rediscovering their purpose. And that being said, I'm not the biggest fan of everything the Trump administration is doing, and I still think that universities serve a very important role in science and medicine, and that's something that needs to be protected.
So again, I just think it's kind of intriguing. Again, you said if we're truly going to enter a golden age, universities should teach students the skills to depict a vision that reflects something meaningful about life. And it does seem to me that that's one of the conversations that we will continue to have about the issue of art, creativity, and imagination. So, Joey, first of all, want to say thank you for writing this piece, but also let me just point people to the link. We have, of course, a place where we say visit the website, click on that button first, and then it will take you to Substack. And the best way to find him is Joey T. McFadden. And I've mentioned just a few of his pieces on everything from art and ideology, which is one of the most recent posts. There's a podcast, and you can find some material there, of course, on everything from liberty to breaking bread and the certainty trap, then columns that have been produced there as well. And so just a lot of great material. And I think if you would want to know a little bit more about him, we've given you a chance to find all of that on the website at pointofview.net. So again, Joey, hope we can call on you in the future, and thank you for writing the column, and thank you for giving us some time today here on Point of View.
Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Going to take a break, and when we come back, let me just mention, as we have, that first of all, these articles that we've been talking about are all available at the website at pointofview.net. Hunter Williams in the first hour, Joey McFadden in the second hour, and when we come back, I want to get into a couple of really controversial issues that are kind of in the news that I think are worthy of some consideration before we wind down. As I mentioned, tomorrow we're going to have a Millennial Roundtable, and of course, that's where we hear from some of the individuals that are part of the group called Young Voices. And of course, Joey McFadden is one of many that we've had on the program. But just before we take a break, one more time, let me mention that we do have a banner there, and it says Viewpoints. Subscribe today. If you click on that, there's an opportunity for you to get the commentary. As we've talked about throughout the week, we've had a few people talk about it, is a 2-minute commentary, which again is something that's heard on about 600 radio stations. I think it's on all of the Bott Radio Network stations, all the American Family radio stations, many of the Moody stations, and many of the stations that carry this program, Point of View. But it would take even less time than 2 minutes for you to read it. I think a lot of people have appreciated it. Matter of fact, so many people say, I not only appreciate getting it because you get some facts and figures and some links, but then I can just hit the refer and send it on. I can post it on my Facebook page or on X, or I can send it to an individual that I think would benefit from that. And so, again, we are making that available. We certainly have begun talking about it because we realize so many people listen to Point of View but don't even know they can get the Viewpoints commentary for free. So it's available on our website at pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
The Bible tells us not to worry, and yet there is a lot of worrying stuff in our world today. Thankfully, the Bible doesn't stop at telling us not to worry. God gives us a next step. He says we need to pray. But sometimes even knowing what to pray can be difficult, and that is why Point of View has relaunched our Pray for America movement, a series of weekly emails to guide you in prayer for our nation. Each week, you'll receive a brief update about a current issue affecting Americans, along with a written prayer that you can easily share with others. We'll also include a short free resource for you in each email so you can learn more about the issue at hand. Will you commit to pray for America? Go to pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner at the top of the page to subscribe. Again, that's pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in America. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, about a half an hour left before the end of the program today. As I mentioned before, of course, tomorrow is our Millennial Roundtable. I mentioned that before. And again, since we had just a minute ago, Joey McFadden, who is an individual that is part of Young Voices. One of the other Young Voices will be with us, and that is William Barclay. We had him on recently, and so he'll be joining Chelsea and Liberty and some others around the roundtable. So I think you'll appreciate that conversation. And I know that some of you have said, I'm really concerned about the next generation, and certainly we talked about some of that in terms of the lack of doctrinal orthodoxy in the younger generation and the conversation we had with Hunter Williams the first hour. But I think you can be encouraged by hearing some of these very articulate voices around the round table, so I know that you will appreciate the conversation there. Then I'll be back with you Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, of course, and I'll get into all of that in just a few minutes. Let's work our way through the last two articles I've posted for you today, and I'll add also one additional issue, and that has to do with the controversy that's developed over the back and forth, the claims back and forth, when you had three New Jersey Democrats in the House of Representatives, as well as the mayor of Newark, who actually stormed, is the phrase that some have used, Delaney Hall Detention Center unannounced. And this is, again, sort of a back and forth that we'll get into. But let me, before we get into the controversy that involves, let's maybe come back to what I call first principles, because sometimes that helps us think through these issues. Let's think about the differences in terms of punishment that would be appropriate. If there's a federal building and you trespass, I think you should be prosecuted. But just because you trespass doesn't mean that we throw away the key and put you in jail for a long period of time. If you then go into a building and vandalize it, it seems to me that that punishment should be greater than if you actually were trespassing, because now you have done certain acts, and I think the punishment should increase. And then number three, that if you assault an officer, that should be the highest punishment. Would you agree? Now, if you accept that, before we even get to New Jersey, let's apply it to two issues we've been talking about. One, of course, going all the way back to January 6th. It is one thing to say that an individual came on the Capitol grounds but did not go into the Capitol. It's quite another to talk about a person that went into the Capitol. It's quite another to talk about an individual that went into the Capitol and vandalized something or took something or broke windows. And it's even worse if that individual went into the Capitol and harmed a police officer. Got it? The Capitol Police. We should recognize that there are a scale of offenses and punishments. And so, as you have heard us say before, it makes no sense, and I think it is a real travesty of justice if an individual was on the Capitol grounds but didn't even go in, or we've heard stories of individuals went in there and prayed but then get locked away as if they are equal to an individual that was actually assaulting an officer. And so you can kind of see how you have to sort of think through the issue, whether you're talking about January 6th, or let's now go to the one we talked about on Friday, the various pro-Hamas, and I'm not sure all of them were students. Matter of fact, I'm sure many of them were not, but students who came in and took over the reading room in the library there at Columbia University, defaced a tremendous significantly amount of this wonderful library, and in a couple of cases actually hurt the campus police until they were moved out, and then there were even assaults against, I believe, the New York police. You can see that we're going to treat the actions differently. Now, once you think through that, and I've used one that had to do with individuals that were may be considered pro-Trump or certainly anti-government, and the all sorts of different anarchists and things like that. Others which were pro-Hamas. It is a little different, but again, nobody's above the law when you're talking about members of the House of Representatives, and the assault that took place there is significant. Again, we have these three representatives: LaMonica McIver, Bonnie Watson Coleman, and Rob Menendez. By the way, if that name sounds familiar, that's the son of the individual serving time. There was some interesting post on X about that. And then Newark's Mayor Ross Baraka, and they actually stormed, according to the press reports, the Delaney Hall Detention Center, which were unannounced. Now, the mayor was arrested on the spot and charged with trespassing, but there's where you get the claim and counterclaim, the charge and countercharge. For example, you have Representative LaMonica posting on X that she says there is shoving, let me go to her comments first. She wrote on X that ICE shoved her and manhandled her and Watson Coleman. And during the press conference, McIver escalated the claim, saying she was assaulted by multiple ICE officers while regional directors of ICE watched it happen. So some of that is posted on X, and some of that came in the press conference. And so this is where, as I have said before, I hope that anybody in law enforcement, I don't care if it's the Capitol Police, I don't care if it's your local police force in your small community, I don't care if it's ICE agents, when you actually have the kind of video cameras necessary, which now are very easy to post on individuals, you can begin to see that the claims don't match the facts. And so here you actually have, and I give you the article, which you'll find on the second page, the body cam video of the altercation on Delaney Hall, in which I think any fair-minded person would say, well, yes, but I see Representative LaMonica shoving and elbowing her way past a DHS agent, that would be the Department of Homeland Security, to get past the gate and get into the property. Now, again, this gets into another issue. When a member of Congress shows up at a federal building, that doesn't mean that the federal building has to open the door to a member of Congress. We saw that when we had this great protest in front of the Department of Education. So a lot of this is street theater. And so what I did was give you an article that shows you both the comments from the members of Congress as well as some of the footage and the body cam photos and video so that you can see it for yourself. And I think any fair-minded person would simply see this as the fact that they came there unannounced, came there to create a stir, really wanted to get into the facility, wanted to use that to call attention to their concerns about deportation and all the rest. But the bottom line is that the Department of Homeland Security's Assistant Secretary, that would be Tricia McLaughlin, said, look, if you assault a law enforcement officer, we will also make sure you answer to justice. And she said, so I think the arrests are still on the table for this. This is an ongoing investigation. Last time I heard, DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, have not announced charges yet about who actually came into the facility, but I really wanted to, as much as possible, give you kind of the point and counterpoint, because depending on which particular news outlet you watch, you're probably only going to get one side or the other. And you will see, of course, some of the postings that will appear in X, for example, right now. The way we were treated, this comes from two of the members of Congress, quote, the way we were treated at Delaney Hall is almost unbelievable. ICE shoved me and manhandled me and arrested the mayor, which, again, the facts are certainly true, but who started what and when did it actually take place? So, again, I found many articles on both sides of this issue. issue. This one at least allows you to see what was posted on X, what was stated at the press conference, and what is actually in the body cam video. And I think most people would say, okay, let's go back to our first principles. It is certainly illegal to trespass on federal property unless you're invited. Certainly, it is illegal to vandalize that. That doesn't apply so much here as it did to Columbia University. And it is certainly illegal to assault an officer. So you, I think, now have a much better look and understanding of what has taken place. And if you see some of these news reports or some of these clips over the next few days, I think at least you know that there is a very worthwhile article that you can find on our website at pointofview.net. Let's take a break. I have a lot more to cover. All that coming up right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let's again apply some of those first principles. I'm just again helping you understand how to kind of think through these issues. And just a minute ago, I recognized that there is some real controversy associated with the desire of 3 members of Congress and the mayor of Newark to enter the ICE detention center. But again, if you think through before you get into the politics of it, what do we require of an individual if they trespass without permission on a federal grounds, if they are engaged in vandalism or assaulting an officer, that is sort of a principle that you need to think through as you then encounter some of these stories. And they are controversial stories, but again, these are the ways to think that through. This one that I have now, which is a piece by David Insera, is entitled, "We Can't Censor Our Way to Progress." And I may not completely agree with all of his conclusions, but even to get into this, let's think this through. Do you have free speech? Yes, we should have free speech, and the censorship of free speech is something we've talked about so often here on Point of View. You have freedom of speech, but you don't have freedom from the consequences of the speech that you articulate. And so it does seem to me that as we get into this other issue of deportation or removing some individuals from this country by canceling their visas, we on the one hand want to acknowledge that you have freedom of speech, but it's not freedom to vandalize. You have freedom of speech, but it's not freedom to call for a revolution or to prevent, in the case of colleges, Jewish students from going into the classroom. You have freedom of speech, but you don't have the freedom to occupy a library and thus prevent students who are studying for their finals from being able to go about their day-to-day activity. And once you understand that, you can begin to see the article that we're going to talk about. David Insera points out the fact that the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, recently declared that the State Department had accumulated dossiers characterizing certain Americans, including now many members of the Trump administration, as purveyors of misinformation and disinformation. This follows the Rubio announcement last month that he would be shutting down the counter-disinformation unit at the State Department. And so he says, certainly, Marco Rubio is right to criticize such attempts at censorship, but he believes that this conflicts in the way the Trump administration has punished immigrants for their speech. So that's the second part of this. But let's take the first part because that's the easiest. And that is the Marco Rubio and the State Department have closed down what's called the Counter Foreign Information Manipulation and Interference Office at the State Department. This was sort of the final incarnation of what used to be known as the Global Engagement Center, which Congress defunded at the end of 2024. You might remember this because we talked about how it would blacklist various groups, especially if they were right of center, maybe if they were libertarian or whatever it might be. And so that is something that I think if we really believe in free speech, we should applaud what Marco Rubio is doing there. David Insera, who is with the Cato Institute, says Marco Rubio is right to close this office to prevent such abuse in the future. Too many government agencies and disinformation experts have labeled Americans' views and speech as disinformation and foreign propaganda. These mistakes, he says, have been causing significant discord, even as they attempt to stop foreign governments' attempts to sow discord. The government has a limited role in combating clear-cut cases of foreign malign influence if officials have relevant intelligence and information they can use to educate Americans and our partners around the world and prosecute foreign bad actors. So, again, David Insera says most fundamentally, Marco Rubio is correct in objecting to the government being involved at all. The problem, according to Rubio, isn't just the wrong people and the NGOs were picked to police disinformation, but the problem was that the government was picking anybody to do this at all. And of course, we've talked about so much of that comes from the Twitter files. So that part don't think is very controversial. But now David Insera says, okay, that's why he says Marco Rubio's action to strip legal immigrants of their visas for disfavored speech are also problematic. As many as several hundred visas seem to be revoked due to pro-Palestinian speech. let's be clear, participating in violence, forcibly taking over buildings or areas of campus, and vetoing the speech of others through heckling can get you ejected from school and result in the cancellation of your legal right to be in the United States. Similarly, other violations of law, including lying to federal officials about your former associations, are justifiable grounds for removal. So, first of all, I don't disagree. He's made the criteria. It's back to what we've said. It's one thing to have free speech. It's quite another to say that free speech allows you to block entrances to universities, or that free speech allows you to take over a library, that free speech allows you to heckle and to actually threaten Jewish students. You see that? What his concern is that there could be, and he believes has happened, a widespread stripping of visas is not about punishing law-breaking immigrants, but rather punishing those with disfavored views. Now, he points out that we should be concerned, and we should. If that becomes a precedent that is established in the Trump administration, think it through in the future. What if you have Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Bernie Sanders the president? I know, hard to imagine right now, but who knows? Someday there could be a president who then would want to actually punish individuals that have conservative views, Christian views, Jewish views, whatever it might be. So that is the case. But he ends by quoting Marco Rubio, and I think Marco Rubio has it right. Our republic is based on putting trust in the ordinary citizenry. Our founding fathers took the bold step of believing that ordinary citizens can sift through information, decide which policies and candidates are best, and vote accordingly. And so David and Sarah says this logic applies to handling misinformation, content moderation on social media, questions about conflict in the Middle East, and countless other free speech issues. We can't silence our way to truth, censor our way to progress, or deport our way to settle debates. I think he's objecting to the use of widespread stripping of visas, and if that is the case, I would agree with him. But so far, most of what I've seen from the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, is to remove the visas of those individuals who are the agitators and the people that have made it very difficult for students on campus to feel safe, or for them to even study for their finals. And as we talked about on Friday, I think that's an issue as well. Both these articles are, of course, in the area of controversy. We don't shy away from controversy here on Point of View, but I do want you to sometimes think through first principles so that as you encounter one of these issues, you begin to think about what's right and what's appropriate, what punishment is appropriate and what is not. And I think you can see that there have been in the past some very significant miscarriages of justice. And if this goes the wrong direction as David and Sarah fears, well, we need to speak out against that as well. That's all we have for today here on Point of View. Tomorrow, of course, is our Millennial Roundtable. If you find yourself saying, well, I'd like to find some of the articles you're talking about, they're all available at the website pointofview.net. Click on that button that says See More. You'll find those articles. I don't think they're posted yet, but sometime in the future we'll get those posted and you'll be able to find those articles, and I think you will benefit from those as well. And again, let me encourage you to find out more about the Hunter Williams book, because I think we need to train our kids in theology. I want to thank Megan and Steve for the help behind the scenes. See you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
Have you subscribed to the Viewpoints commentary? No? Well, you're missing out on an essential free resource straight from Point of View's Kerby Anderson. Viewpoints are Kerby's free daily email commentaries covering any and every issue relevant to your faith, your family, and your freedom. And what makes Viewpoints essential is how packed they are with information you will not get anywhere else, while also being a quick read. In 2 minutes or less, you can become better educated about an important issue affecting America. And Viewpoints is easily shareable, making it a great resource to forward to your friends or also to post on social media. Don't miss out on this essential free resource from Kerby Anderson and Point of View. Join the thousands of Americans who receive viewpoints by enrolling today. Do it right now at pointofview.net/enroll. Again, it's free and it takes just a moment. pointofview.net/enroll. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.